A millionaire left his wife for another woman, thinking she was no longer useful. Her next move left him speechless. Daniel Kensington stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, staring out at the city skyline bathed in the amber hues of the setting sun. The glass of scotch in his hand swirled lazily, the ice clinking against the crystal. From up here, everything seemed small, manageable, just the way he liked it. Control was everything to Daniel, and he had spent years mastering it, both in business and in life. But tonight, there was a weight on his chest that he couldn't quite shake, a nagging sensation clawing at the edges of his carefully curated reality. He turned away from the view and glanced at the reflection staring back at him in the mirror across the room. Tall, impeccably dressed in his tailored tuxedo, with sharp features that once radiated confidence but now hinted at something darker, doubt. He pushed the thought aside and took another sip of his drink. This night wasn't about the past. It was about the future, and that future was standing just a few feet away, adjusting an earring in the reflection of their shared mirror. Sophia Monroe, young, radiant, and effortlessly captivating. She was draped in a crimson gown that clung to her every curve, her blonde hair cascading down in soft waves. She caught him watching her and smiled, a smile designed to reassure him, to remind him that he had won. "You're staring," she teased, turning to face him fully, the slit of her dress revealing just enough to keep his mind distracted. "Can you blame me?" Daniel smirked, stepping closer, placing a possessive hand on her waist. "You look perfect." Sophia leaned into him, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Tonight's going to be amazing. Everyone will see us together. No more whispers about Rebecca, no more lingering questions. Rebecca." The name sliced through his thoughts like a knife, but Daniel refused to let it show. Rebecca Kensington had been his wife, his partner, his greatest ally, and in the end, his greatest opponent. They had built his empire together, she with her razor-sharp legal mind, and he with his relentless ambition. When they were a team, they were unstoppable. But as the years passed, the partnership had fractured, and in a moment of weakness, or perhaps arrogance, he had replaced her. Sophia was younger, easier. No constant questions, no challenges to his authority. And yet, despite her beauty and charm, a part of him still felt hollow. He snapped back to the present and tightened his grip around Sophia's waist. "You're right," he said, forcing a smile. "Tonight is about us." The gala at the Beaumont Hotel was already in full swing by the time they arrived. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the murmur of polite conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. Waiters glided through the crowd with silver trays of champagne, and the city's elite mingled, their eyes discreetly drifting toward Daniel and Sophia as they entered. Daniel was used to the attention, the way conversations paused when he walked into a room. He reveled in it, but tonight, it felt different. He caught snippets of hushed conversations as he passed. He brought her. No sign of Rebecca? Did you hear who she's working with now? Daniel's jaw clenched. He led Sophia through the crowd, offering nods and tight-lipped smiles to familiar faces. The whispers followed him like ghosts, but he refused to acknowledge them. He had moved on, and that was all that mattered. Or so he thought. Halfway through the evening, just as he was starting to enjoy himself, a familiar presence rippled through the room, sending a shiver down his spine. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. The sudden hush, the way the air seemed to shift, it could only mean one thing. Rebecca. She stood at the entrance, poised and confident in an emerald green dress that clung to her figure in all the right ways. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves, her makeup flawless, but it wasn't just her beauty that commanded attention. It was the power she exuded effortlessly. And she wasn't alone. Victor Langston stood beside her, a smug expression on his face as if he had already won a battle Daniel didn't even know had begun. Langston, his biggest rival. The man whose entire business model seemed to revolve around outpacing Kensington enterprises. Daniel's stomach turned to stone. Sophia, sensing the shift in his demeanor, whispered, "Who's that?" "That," Daniel said, his voice tight, "is my ex-wife." Sophia stiffened, her fingers curling around the stem of her champagne flute. "She's with Langston?" Seems that way, Daniel muttered. Eyes locked on Rebecca as she made her way through the crowd, all eyes on her. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Kensington felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Uncertainty. Rebecca's eyes met his across the room, and a small, knowing smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't the warm smile he had once known. This one was calculated, sharp, dangerous. She approached, Langston in tow, and Daniel steeled himself. He wouldn't let her see him flinch. Daniel, Rebecca greeted smoothly, her voice like silk laced with steel. It's been a while. Rebecca, he replied with an easy smile, masking the unease stirring inside him. You look well. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking towards Sophia with cool assessment. I see you've been keeping busy. Daniel ignored the barb. And you? His gaze hardened as he glanced at Langston. This is unexpected. Victor chuckled, shaking Daniel's hand with a little too much enthusiasm. Oh, I think you'll find we're quite the team, he said with a glint in his eye. We have a lot of mutual interests these days. Daniel's grip tightened. I bet you do. Rebecca's smile never faltered. We'll be seeing a lot more of each other soon, she said casually. Business, you know. And with that, she walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, his mind racing. He barely registered Sophia's attempts to steer him back to the party. He needed answers. Later that night, as Sophia slept soundly beside him, Daniel stood by the window, scotch in hand. His phone buzzed with a message from his CFO. We need to talk. Urgent. His grip tightened on the glass. Rebecca wasn't just here to show off. She was back, and she was coming for him. And if there was one thing Daniel Kensington hated, it was losing. But this time, the opponent knew him better than anyone ever had. And she wasn't here to play nice. What would you do if your biggest rival had access to your deepest secrets? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. The grand ballroom of the Beaumont Hotel shimmered with golden chandeliers, casting a soft glow over the elite of New York City. Conversations buzzed in a low murmur, punctuated by the clinking of fine crystal and the occasional burst of laughter from tightly knit social circles. Tonight wasn't just any night. It was the annual Kensington Industries Gala, a spectacle Daniel Kensington had meticulously curated over the years to cement his dominance in the corporate world. He stood at the top of the marble staircase, surveying the sea of well-dressed guests below. Power brokers, politicians, media moguls, all present, all waiting for him. And on his arm, Sophia Monroe, radiant and alluring in a shimmering red gown that left little to the imagination. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. They're all staring at us, she purred, her breath warm and teasing. Daniel smirked, adjusting the cufflinks on his custom-tailored tuxedo. Let them. Descending the stairs with the ease of a man who owned the world, Daniel led Sophia into the crowd, greeting familiar faces with polished charm. The whispers followed them, but Daniel barely paid them any mind. He had one. Rebecca was old news, a relic of his past, and tonight was about his future, with Sophia by his side. Yet, no amount of strategic positioning, no carefully rehearsed small talk, could prepare him for what happened next. It started subtly, with a shift in the room's energy. A ripple, a murmur. Heads began turning towards the entrance, conversations faltering mid-sentence. Daniel noticed the change, his gut tightening instinctively. And then he saw her. Rebecca Kensington. She moved through the grand entrance with effortless grace, her emerald green gown a stark contrast to the sea of black and gold around her. Her dark hair was styled in elegant waves, framing her sharp features with an undeniable allure. But it wasn't just her presence that sent a cold shock through Daniel's veins. It was the man at her side. Victor Langston, a venomous rival who had spent years trying to chip away at Kensington Industries, failing every time. Yet here he was, standing confidently beside Rebecca, their partnership exuding a quiet but unmistakable power. Daniel's grip on Sophia's waist involuntarily tightened, his pulse quickening. What the hell is she doing here? He muttered under his breath. Sophia's brows furrowed in confusion. Who is she? My ex-wife, Daniel said tightly, his jaw clenched. His eyes never left Rebecca as she scanned the room, finally landing on him. For a fleeting second, their gazes locked across the ballroom, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. It wasn't the warm, affectionate smile he once knew. It was sharp, calculated, and chilling. Rebecca moved towards him with deliberate poise, Victor following closely. As she approached, the scent of her perfume, familiar yet distant, filled his senses. She stopped just a breath away, her expression unreadable. "Daniel," she greeted, her voice smooth and laced with a subtle amusement. "It's been a while." "Rebecca," he replied, forcing his voice to stay even. "I didn't realize you were attending." Rebecca's lips curved slightly. "I imagine you didn't." She glanced at Sophia with a polite but dismissive nod. "And you must be Sophia. I've heard so much." Sophia stiffened slightly but smiled, offering a delicate handshake. "Nice to meet you, Rebecca." Victor stepped forward, his smile all too smug. "Daniel," he said. Offering a handshake, Daniel had no choice but to accept. "Hope you don't mind, but Rebecca and I have been reacquainted." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he returned the handshake with just enough force to make a point. "Reacquainted?" he echoed, eyeing Rebecca suspiciously. "Oh, we have quite a lot of catching up to do," Rebecca interjected smoothly. "And I'm sure we'll be seeing much more of each other, especially in court." The words hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. The room around him blurred for a moment as he processed the implication. His carefully curated image, his business, his entire empire. She was coming for it. Sophia, sensing the tension, tried to step in. "Well, I'm sure tonight isn't the place to talk business," she said, her voice lighter than the atmosphere demanded. Rebecca smiled again, but this time, there was something deeper behind it. A quiet challenge. "Oh, tonight is just the beginning." With that, she turned gracefully, linking her arm through Victor's and walking away, leaving Daniel standing in stunned silence. Sophia tugged at his sleeve. "Daniel, what was that about?" He exhaled sharply, his eyes following Rebecca as she disappeared into the crowd. "Trouble," he murmured, draining his champagne in one swift motion. The ride home was quiet. Sophia's attempts at conversation met with monosyllabic responses. Daniel's mind was elsewhere, replaying the encounter over and over. Rebecca wasn't just making an appearance, she was making a statement. And if she was working with Victor Langston, it meant one thing: war. Back at the penthouse, Daniel paced the sleek marble floors, his thoughts running wild. Sophia sat on the couch, watching him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Daniel, talk to me. What's going on?" He stopped mid-step, rubbing his temple. "Rebecca, she knows everything about my business, my deals, my weaknesses. And now she's working with Langston." He let out a humorless laugh. "She's about to make my life a living hell." Sophia frowned. "But you have the upper hand, right? You're always 10 steps ahead." Daniel clenched his fists, frustration brewing beneath the surface. "Not this time," he admitted, his voice low. "Rebecca knows every inch of my empire. If she wanted to destroy me, she knows exactly where to strike." His phone buzzed on the counter. He grabbed it, his CFO's name flashing across the screen. Daniel's heart sank. "We need to talk. It's urgent." Sophia stood and walked toward him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. "You always do." Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the window. No, this time was different. This time, the battle wasn't just about business. It was personal, and Rebecca was no longer the woman he had once underestimated. The Beaumont Hotel Gala had ended hours ago, but Daniel Kensington's mind was still trapped in that ballroom, replaying every second of his encounter with Rebecca. He stood in his dimly lit penthouse, staring out over the city skyline, the ice in his untouched scotch melting slowly in the glass. The once invincible feeling that came with success had been replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Rebecca's presence had always been an anchor, steady, unwavering. But tonight, she was something else entirely. She was an adversary. Sophia padded barefoot across the marble floor, her silk robe trailing behind her. "Daniel," she said softly, sliding her arms around his waist from behind, resting her head against his back. "You're too tense." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Rebecca's working with Victor Langston," he said, his voice quieter than usual, as if saying it too loudly would make it more real. Sophia sighed. "You're overthinking it. She's probably just trying to rattle you." He turned to face her, searching her eyes for the confidence he no longer felt himself. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Rebecca doesn't rattle. She plans. She executes. And she wins." Sophia pulled away slightly, biting her lip. "So what are you going to do about it?" Daniel downed the scotch in one go, setting the glass down with more force than necessary. "First, I find out exactly what she knows. And then I make sure it doesn't matter." Sophia folded her arms, watching him carefully. "You think you can just outmaneuver her like you do everyone else?" He smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think. I know." But deep down, Daniel wasn't sure anymore. Rebecca knew the inner workings of Kensington Enterprises better than anyone. She had been the architect of many of its legal victories and strategic acquisitions. And if she had handed all of that over to Langston, Daniel's carefully constructed empire could be in jeopardy. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his office earlier than usual, the skyline still bathed in dawn's golden hue. He sat at the head of the long glass conference table, drumming his fingers against the surface, waiting for his most trusted executives to arrive. When his CFO, Jonathan Pierce, walked in with a concerned expression, Daniel's stomach tightened. "What's the urgency, Jonathan?" Jonathan slid a thick folder across the table. "We just received notice that Langston's legal team is preparing to challenge 3 of our recent acquisitions. Claims of regulatory violations, insider dealings. It's comprehensive, Daniel. And it has Rebecca written all over it." Daniel's hands tightened around the folder as he flipped through the pages, scanning the accusations. It was precise, surgical, the kind of legal offensive only Rebecca could mastermind. He could almost hear her voice explaining each clause, anticipating every counterargument. "She knows exactly where to hit," Jonathan continued. "If this goes public, it could tank our stock price overnight." Daniel shut the folder with a snap. "We're not going to let it get that far." Jonathan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You have a plan?" Daniel forced a tight smile. "I always have a plan." But as the meeting continued, Daniel realized just how vulnerable his empire truly was. Rebecca had left no stone unturned. Every weakness he had ignored, every gray area he had exploited, she was bringing it all to light. And Langston, smug and relentless, would be more than happy to watch him burn. Later that evening, Daniel's frustration simmered as he paced his penthouse, phone in hand, dialing Rebecca's number for the 3rd time that day. She had ignored his previous calls, and tonight was no different. Finally, he received a response, not a call, but a text message. "Meet me. Café Lorette. 9 p.m. Come alone." Daniel stared at the screen, his chest tightening. Rebecca wasn't one to invite him for a casual drink, and the request to come alone sent warning bells through his head. Still, he couldn't pass up the opportunity to confront her. The cafe was quieter than Daniel remembered, a quaint corner spot tucked away from the chaos of Midtown. He spotted Rebecca immediately, sitting near the window, back straight, a small espresso cup resting delicately between her fingers. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm but unreadable. "You're late," she said, taking a sip of her drink. Daniel slid into the seat across from her, studying her face for any signs of the woman he once knew. "You always liked being early," he said, forcing a smirk. Rebecca's lips curled in a faint smile. "And you always liked thinking you were in control." She set down the cup and folded her hands. "So, what do you want, Daniel?" He leaned forward, his voice low and edged with frustration. "I want to know what the hell you're doing with Langston." Rebecca tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether he was even worth answering. "It's simple," she said finally. "Victor values what I bring to the table. You didn't." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about us, Rebecca. You're playing with fire." Rebecca's eyes hardened. "No, Daniel. I'm finally playing the game on my terms." She leaned in slightly. "You thought you could replace me, brush me aside like I was just another deal you closed. but I built Kensington Industries with you. And now, I'm going to take it apart." Daniel's stomach twisted, but he masked it with a cocky grin. "You always had a flair for the dramatic." Rebecca's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't drama. It's justice." She leaned back, crossing her legs, the emerald silk of her dress catching the dim cafe light. "You think you can outplay me, but you forget. I taught you everything you know." Daniel's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and Rebecca saw it. She knew she had struck a nerve. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice quieter, more pleading than he intended. Rebecca held his gaze, a flicker of something softer in her eyes. Just for a moment. Then, she stood up, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "It's already done, Daniel." She walked away, leaving Daniel sitting in the quiet cafe, his chest tight with something dangerously close to regret. Back at the penthouse, Sophia waited for him, perched on the edge of the couch in her silk robe. "Well?" she asked expectantly. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "She's serious, and she's not backing down." Sophia frowned. "So what's your next move?" Daniel stared out the window at the city beyond, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We fight," he said finally, but the words felt hollow, because deep down, Daniel knew Rebecca wasn't just coming after his company. She was coming after him. The walls of Daniel Kensington's penthouse felt suffocating, despite the breathtaking view of the New York skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood there, staring out at the city he had conquered, but tonight it felt different, less like a victory and more like a battlefield. The war had begun, and his ex-wife, Rebecca, was no longer just a memory. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had chosen his most ruthless rival, Victor Langston, as her ally. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was his attorney, Grant Holden, his voice tight and concerned. "Daniel, we need to talk. Rebecca's team just filed a motion to freeze your assets pending an investigation. They're coming at you from every angle." Daniel gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "What are they investigating?" Grant sighed on the other end. "Everything. Your latest acquisitions, your partnerships, anything that can paint you as a corrupt businessman. And with Rebecca feeding Langston everything she knows, they have plenty of ammunition." Daniel cursed under his breath. He knew Rebecca was strategic, meticulous. She never made a move without calculating 10 steps ahead. And if she had convinced Langston to go after his finances, it meant she was ready to dismantle everything he had built piece by piece. "We need to find a way to hit back," Daniel said, pacing the length of his office. "I'll dig into their filings," Grant replied. "But Daniel, you need to prepare for the worst. Rebecca knows your weak spots." "Yeah," Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I know." Hours later, Daniel found himself sitting in his study. The lights dimmed, papers sprawled across his desk. He stared at old legal contracts, memos Rebecca had once drafted, each one a testament to how well she had protected him in the past. Now, those same skills were being used against him. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Sophia peeked in, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. "Still working?" she asked softly, stepping inside and wrapping her arms around his shoulders. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "Rebecca isn't playing around." Sophia frowned, perching on the edge of his desk. "I still don't get it. Why is she doing this? What does she want?" Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Control, revenge, or maybe both. She built this company with me, and I threw her aside like she was replaceable." Sophia looked down, twirling a strand of her hair. "Maybe she just wants to remind you that she never was." Daniel chuckled bitterly. "She's doing a damn good job of it." There was a moment of silence before Sophia leaned in closer. "So what's your next move?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "I need leverage. If Rebecca wants to play this game, then I'll remind her who taught her how to win." The next morning, Daniel met with his private investigator, Cole Bennett, in a secluded booth at a downtown cafe. Cole, a no-nonsense man with years of experience digging into the dirt of New York's elite, slid a manila envelope across the table. "I've been looking into Rebecca's recent activities," Cole said in a low voice. She's been discreet, but not invincible. There's something about her connection to Langston that's unusual. Daniel flipped through the documents. Photos of Rebecca and Langston meeting in discreet locations, bank transactions that raised red flags. What am I looking at? Daniel asked, narrowing his eyes. Langston's not just using Rebecca for legal expertise, Cole continued. He's got a stake in something bigger. There's a property acquisition under her name, but the funds trace back to Langston's offshore accounts. Daniel tapped the photos thoughtfully. So, what? He's laundering money through her? Possibly, Cole said, but it could be leverage. Something to hold over her if things don't go his way. Daniel's lips curled into a slow smirk. So Rebecca isn't as untouchable as she thinks. Cole nodded. Looks that way. Daniel leaned back, the weight on his chest lightening slightly. Good work, Cole. Keep digging. If there's a crack in her armor, I want to find it. Later that evening, Daniel made his way to Rebecca's office, his presence drawing whispers from her staff as he strode through the sleek corridors. When he finally entered her office, Rebecca looked up from her desk, unimpressed. You must be desperate, she said, leaning back in her chair with that familiar, infuriating smirk. Daniel closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her, placing Cole's envelope on her desk. I did some digging, he said smoothly. Langston's not just using you. He's setting you up. Rebecca's expression remained unreadable, but Daniel knew her too well. He saw the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she masked it. You expect me to believe you? Daniel shrugged. I expect you to be smarter than this. You're not a pawn, Rebecca, but you're acting like one. Rebecca sat forward, her tone sharp. I'm nobody's pawn, Daniel. Least of all yours. Then prove it, Daniel countered, his voice low but laced with challenge. Walk away from Langston. Come back where you belong. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel could see the wheels turning in her head. But then, she shook her head slowly, a sad smile touching her lips. It's too late for that, Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. You sure about that? Rebecca's eyes darkened. I didn't come this far just to run back to you. Daniel knew he had hit a nerve, but Rebecca was still in control, for now. He stood, straightening his jacket. I guess we'll see. As he walked out of her office, he couldn't help but smile to himself. He had planted the seed of doubt, and that was the first step in winning the war. Back at the penthouse, Daniel poured himself another drink, his mind racing through the possibilities. Sophia curled up on the couch, watching him carefully. You think you got to her? She asked. Daniel took a slow sip, his eyes gleaming with renewed determination. I don't need to get to her, he said. I just need to make her second herself. Sophia tilted her head. And if she doesn't? Daniel smirked. Then we play dirty. The game had begun, and Daniel wasn't about to lose. Rebecca had taught him everything he knew about strategy, but she had forgotten one thing. He had learned to adapt. And this time, he would be the one pulling the strings. Rebecca might have declared war, but Daniel Kensington was about to remind her why he always came out on top. The following weeks unfolded like a slow, calculated game of chess, with each move carefully considered yet fraught with tension. Daniel Kensington found himself caught between two conflicting emotions: his relentless drive to maintain control and the gnawing anxiety that Rebecca was always one step ahead. The cracks in his once impenetrable empire were beginning to show, and it was only a matter of time before the fractures turned into a collapse. Daniel sat in his office, the dim city lights outside casting long shadows across the sleek furniture. His fingers tapped restlessly against his mahogany desk as he reread the latest reports from his legal team. Rebecca and Victor Langston had officially filed lawsuits challenging multiple mergers, acquisitions, and licensing agreements that he had previously considered airtight. She's not playing fair, Jonathan Pierce, his CFO, muttered from across the room. He leaned against the window, his posture tense. She's attacking the core of our business, Daniel. Regulatory investigations, insider trading allegations. She knows exactly where to hit. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. She's not playing at all, Jonathan. She's dismantling everything I built. Pierce hesitated, then asked, Do you think there's a chance she's still doing this for personal reasons? Or is this just business now? Daniel's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe it was business, that Rebecca was acting purely out of professional ambition, but deep down, he knew better. This was personal. She wanted him to feel what she had felt when he discarded her, humiliated her, replaced her. And she was doing an excellent job. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sophia peeked inside, dressed in a satin robe, her hair cascading over one shoulder. "You've been in here all night," she said, stepping inside and perching on the edge of his desk. "Come to bed," Daniel sighed, standing up and rolling his shoulders. "I can't, Sophia." "Not yet." She reached for his hand, her touch gentle but insistent. "You're obsessing over this, Daniel. Maybe if you just—" "I can't just let her win," he snapped, pulling his hand away. "You don't understand what's at stake here." Sophia's expression hardened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it with a soft smile. "I just don't want to see you consumed by this," she murmured, standing up and brushing a kiss against his cheek. "Don't let her control you from the sidelines." As she left, Daniel stared after her, the weight of her words lingering. Control. That was the very thing slipping through his fingers, and no amount of strategy could seem to tighten his grip. Days later, Daniel found himself sitting at a high-end restaurant, sipping a scotch as he waited for an old contact, one who owed him a favor. Across from him sat Julian Grayson, a corporate investigator with a reputation for digging deep and delivering results. Julian set down a thick file with a smirk. "I did some digging into Rebecca's activities before she linked up with Langston," he said, flipping it open. "It turns out she's been planning this for months. Offshore accounts, asset transfers, discreet legal consultations. She's been preparing for war while you were busy playing house with your new girl." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line as he absorbed the information. "Anything I can use against her?" Julian chuckled, tapping a specific page. "There's one thing, her nonprofit work. She's been funding a foundation in her father's name, but there are gaps in the financials. If you expose discrepancies, it might damage her credibility." Daniel stared at the report, his mind whirring. He had never wanted to play dirty with Rebecca, but she had left him no choice. "Good work, Julian," he said, slipping the folder into his briefcase. "Keep digging. I want to know every move before she makes it." Back at Kensington Enterprises headquarters, Daniel called for an emergency meeting with his top executives. As he walked into the glass-walled boardroom, tension hung thick in the air. His legal counsel, Sarah Manning, leaned forward, expression grim. "We have a bigger problem," she said, sliding a document across the table. "Rebecca's team is pushing for an injunction that could halt operations on our flagship project." Daniel skimmed through the document, his frustration mounting. "This is ridiculous. They can, Daniel," Sarah cut in. "And they will. She knows our timelines, our dependencies. She's using your own strategies against you." Daniel sat back, his mind racing. Rebecca had always been meticulous, but he had underestimated just how far she was willing to go. And worse, how deeply she understood his tactics. After all, they had been hers too. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel caught himself staring at the empty chair across from him, the seat Rebecca had once occupied. Her absence left a void far greater than he had ever admitted. That evening, Rebecca's call came unexpectedly. Daniel answered on the first ring, his voice cold. "What do you want?" Rebecca's voice, calm and composed as ever, sent a chill down his spine. "Just thought I'd remind you, Daniel, that this is only the beginning." He chuckled, masking the anxiety curling in his chest. "Is that a threat, Rebecca?" "It's a promise," she replied. "You underestimated me once. I won't let that happen again." Daniel leaned against his desk, staring out at the skyline. "What's your endgame, Rebecca? You want my company? My reputation? What do you really want?" There was a pause on the other end before Rebecca spoke softly. "I want you to know what it feels like to have everything you built taken away, piece by piece." Her words hit harder than he expected, and for the first time, Daniel felt something dangerously close to regret. "You think I haven't thought about that every day?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You think I don't know I screwed up?" Rebecca's silence stretched for a long moment. Knowing it and paying for it are two different things, Daniel. You'll figure that out soon enough. The line went dead, leaving Daniel standing alone in his office, the weight of his mistakes pressing down harder than ever. Days passed, and the pressure mounted. Sophia's presence in his life, once a welcome distraction, now felt like an intrusion. The media was beginning to pick up on the legal battles, and shareholders were starting to ask questions. Daniel was a man used to pressure, but this time it felt different. It felt personal. Rebecca wasn't just attacking his business. She was attacking his very foundation. The version of himself he had so carefully constructed over the years was unraveling, and with every headline, with every legal document delivered to his office, he realized that the one person who had always been by his side now stood firmly against him. And she wasn't stopping until he lost everything. The game was no longer about winning. It was about survival. The pressure was mounting, and Daniel Kensington felt it with every breath he took. The once unshakable fortress of Kensington Enterprises was beginning to crack under the weight of Rebecca's relentless assault. Every day brought a new lawsuit, a fresh scandal, and another headline questioning the stability of his empire. The media was having a field day, and investors were growing restless. Daniel sat in his dimly lit office, the skyline of Manhattan sprawling beyond the glass walls. He leaned forward, staring at the latest legal brief his team had prepared, a counter to Rebecca's most recent claim of financial misconduct. His fingers drummed against the polished surface of his desk, frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. Sophia walked in, draped in an elegant silk robe, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "Daniel," she said softly, leaning against the doorframe, "you need to take a break." He didn't look up. "I don't have time for breaks, Sophia. Not when Rebecca is breathing down my neck," she sighed, stepping closer and placing a delicate hand on his shoulder. "She's not going to stop, is she?" Daniel finally met her gaze, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "No, and I wouldn't expect her to." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice lowering. "But I can't let her win." Sophia traced slow circles on his shoulder. "Maybe it's not about winning, Daniel. Maybe it's about making peace." Daniel chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Rebecca doesn't want peace. She wants to destroy me." Sophia hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then maybe you need to fight her on her level." Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "What are you suggesting?" She walked around his desk, perching on the edge. "You always told me business is war. So why not treat it like one?" She leaned in, her voice laced with temptation. "Find out what Rebecca's weakness is. Hit her where it hurts." Daniel's gaze darkened as he considered her words. He had always played fair, well, as fair as someone in his position could, but Rebecca had forced his hand. If she wanted war, he'd give her one. The next morning, Daniel met with Julian Grayson once again, this time in a secluded office in the financial district. The investigator spread out several documents across the table, his expression grim. "There's something you should see," Julian said, pointing to a bank statement. "Rebecca's been making sizable anonymous donations to a firm overseas. At first glance, it looks like philanthropy, but dig deeper." Daniel leaned in, scanning the papers. "It's a shell company," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "Exactly," Julian confirmed. "It's linked to one of Langston's subsidiaries. I'm willing to bet she doesn't know about the connection." Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling over him. If Rebecca's money was being funneled into Langston's operations without her knowledge, it meant she was vulnerable. She had a blind spot, a flaw he could exploit. "Give me everything on this," Daniel ordered. "I want every transaction, every correspondence." Julian nodded. "I'll dig deeper, but Daniel, if you use this against her, it's going to get ugly." Daniel's lips curled into a grim smile. "It already is." That evening, Daniel found himself outside Rebecca's office building, the cool night air biting against his skin. He hadn't seen her in person since their tense cafe meeting, but tonight, he needed answers, face to face. When Rebecca finally emerged, dressed impeccably in a sleek black coat, she barely reacted to the sight of him leaning against his car. "Daniel," she greeted, her voice devoid of emotion. What a surprise. He straightened, his eyes locking onto hers. We need to talk. Rebecca glanced at her watch, unimpressed. I don't think there's anything left to say. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. I think there is. You've made your point, Rebecca. You want to make me bleed? Fine. But what happens when you realize you're bleeding, too? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't falter. I'm not the one losing, Daniel. You are. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to her. You're trusting Langston with your future. But did you ever stop to wonder what he's doing with your money? Rebecca's brows furrowed as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the details. For the first time, Daniel saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. This isn't possible, she murmured. Oh, it is, Daniel replied smoothly. You're being used, Rebecca. Langston doesn't care about you or your so-called justice. He's using you as a pawn to take me down while lining his own pockets. Rebecca swallowed hard, gripping the paper tightly. You think this changes anything? Daniel stepped closer, his voice soft but sharp. I think it makes you realize that maybe, just maybe, you're fighting the wrong enemy. There was a long silence between them, the tension thick and suffocating. Finally, Rebecca looked up, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and uncertainty. This doesn't mean you win, Daniel. I don't need to win, he said, his voice low. I just need you to stop before you lose yourself in this. Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, the document clutched tightly in her hand. Back at the penthouse, Daniel poured himself a drink, his thoughts racing. Sophia watched him carefully from across the room, her expression unreadable. Did it work? She asked finally. Daniel took a slow sip, his eyes distant. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I planted the seed. Sophia nodded, then walked over, placing a hand on his arm. Just don't forget what's really important, Daniel. Don't let her pull you down with her. Daniel exhaled, his gaze fixed on the skyline. He had spent years building an empire, controlling everything and everyone around him. But now, for the first time, he realized that control was an illusion. And the game he was playing with Rebecca? It was far from over. Daniel Kensington sat in his office, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on his shoulders. The city skyline beyond his window glowed in the night, but for the first time in years, he felt no satisfaction in it. The walls of his empire, once fortified by his own iron will, were crumbling under Rebecca's relentless attack. Every day brought a new challenge, a new lawsuit, a fresh wave of media speculation, and an ever-growing sense of uncertainty within his own company. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of a file on his desk, the same file that contained evidence of Rebecca's financial ties to Langston. It had been days since he had handed it to her, and since then, she had been uncharacteristically quiet. No new filings, no public statements. Silence had never been Rebecca's style, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His phone buzzed, breaking the stillness of the room. The name on the screen made his pulse quicken. Rebecca. He hesitated for a beat before answering. Daniel, she said, her voice as composed as ever, but carrying an unfamiliar edge of vulnerability. Meet me. My office. Now. He didn't hesitate. The Kensington legal building loomed before him, a place he once considered home. As he stepped through the revolving doors, the scent of freshly polished wood and expensive leather stirred a flood of memories. Late nights working side by side, whispered conversations over legal documents, and stolen moments that once felt like the foundation of something unshakable. Rebecca was waiting in her office, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out over the city. Her reflection in the glass was unreadable, but Daniel could sense the tension in her posture. You actually came, she said without turning around. Daniel closed the door behind him. You asked. She finally faced him, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. Regret, perhaps, or weakness. You found something, she said, gesturing toward the folder still clutched in his hand. Daniel tossed it onto the desk. I did. Langston's using you, Rebecca. You're smarter than this. Rebecca sighed, crossing her arms. I know, she admitted, surprising him. I suspected something wasn't right, but I ignored it. I was too focused on bringing you down. Daniel stepped closer, his voice softer now. Rebecca, what is this really about? Because it's not just business anymore. Her lips parted, but no words came. She turned back to the window, her arms hugging herself, and for the first time, Daniel saw something he hadn't expected: doubt. I wanted to hurt you, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted you to feel even a fraction of what I felt when you replaced me. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I was wrong, Rebecca. I made mistakes, ones I can't take back. But this war? It's not going to fix what happened between us. Rebecca turned to face him, her eyes fierce but conflicted. And what do you suggest, Daniel? That I just walk away? Forget everything? He took a step closer, his voice measured. I'm suggesting we stop destroying each other before there's nothing left. Rebecca studied him for a long moment before shaking her head with a small, bitter laugh. You always did know how to talk your way out of things. Daniel's expression softened. Because I know you, Rebecca. I know this isn't who you are. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time in a long while, he saw a flicker of the woman he once loved, determined, brilliant, but vulnerable beneath the armor she had built around herself. After a long pause, she sighed. I need time. Daniel nodded, stepping back. Take it, but be careful with Langston. He won't hesitate to throw you under the bus the moment it benefits him. Rebecca smirked, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I can handle Victor. Daniel held her gaze for a beat longer, then turned toward the door. I hope so. As he walked out of her office, he felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. For the first time, there was a crack in the war they had been waging against each other. But whether it would lead to peace or further destruction remained to be seen. Back at the penthouse, Sophia was waiting for him, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up when he entered, her eyes scanning his face carefully. How did it go? She asked. Daniel loosened his tie, collapsing onto the armchair opposite her. It's complicated. Sophia leaned forward, placing her glass on the coffee table. Complicated how? She's not backing down, is she? He shook his head. I don't know yet. She knows she's in deeper than she thought, but she's not ready to walk away. Sophia sighed, sitting back with a frown. So what now? We just wait for her to make the next move? Daniel rubbed his temples. No, we make ours. Sophia studied him for a moment before nodding. Good. Because if she thinks she can manipulate you again, she's wrong. Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, but he said nothing. Deep down, he knew that Rebecca's influence over him had never truly faded. The battle between them wasn't just about business or revenge. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had fully acknowledged. The next morning, Daniel met with his legal team, a new energy coursing through him. Rebecca might have been reconsidering her position, but that didn't mean he could afford to be complacent. We're going on the offensive, he told them, his voice firm. Langston has been sloppy, and we're going to exploit that. His lawyers exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. What about Rebecca? Jonathan asked. Daniel's expression hardened. She'll have to decide where she stands. But if she's smart, she'll realize that siding with Langston was her biggest mistake. He paused, glancing at the stack of files in front of him. And if she doesn't? Jonathan pressed. Daniel's lips curved into a grim smile. Then she'll be collateral damage. Late that night, Daniel received another message from Rebecca. Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk. He stared at the screen for a long moment, conflicted emotions swirling inside him. He knew whatever Rebecca wanted to say next could change everything, again. But whether it was for better or worse, only time would tell. Rebecca was no longer just his greatest rival. She was the one person who could still unravel him completely. The weight of the past weeks hung over Daniel Kensington like a suffocating fog. He had always prided himself on being able to anticipate every move, staying ahead of the competition with an almost ruthless precision. But Rebecca's return had thrown him off balance in ways he hadn't anticipated. Now, sitting in his penthouse office, the glow of the city beyond the vast windows feeling more distant than ever, he faced a reality he never thought possible. He was losing. Daniel drummed his fingers against the mahogany desk, staring at his phone. Rebecca's message from the night before lingered in his mind. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk." Those words unsettled him more than they should have. It wasn't like Rebecca to seek closure. She thrived on control, on calculated moves. If she wanted to talk, it meant something had shifted. Sophia entered the room quietly, her silk robe barely making a sound as she walked toward him. "You've been sitting here all night," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're letting her get in your head," Daniel sighed, rolling his shoulders back. "She's always been in my head, Sophia. That's the problem." Sophia frowned, sitting on the edge of his desk. "Then maybe it's time to stop playing defense and make your move." Daniel stared at her, then back at the cityscape. "And what move would that be?" Sophia leaned in, her voice low and deliberate. "You cut her off. You make it impossible for her to come after you. Freeze her out of every deal, every connection she still has to Kensington Enterprises. You're Daniel Kensington. You don't let anyone control your narrative." Daniel exhaled, considering her words. She was right. He had allowed Rebecca to dictate the terms of their battle for too long. He needed to remind her who he was. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the quiet, upscale cafe Rebecca had chosen. He spotted her instantly, seated near the back, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of her. As he approached, she looked up, her gaze unwavering and calm. "Daniel," she greeted, her tone betraying nothing. He slid into the seat across from her, his posture tense but composed. "Rebecca." There was a beat of silence between them before she spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted, stirring her coffee absently. "About Langston. About me." Daniel watched her carefully. "And?" Rebecca sighed, looking down at the cup as if it held all the answers. "You were right. He's been using me. I thought I could control the situation, but I underestimated him." She finally met his gaze, her expression laced with something he rarely saw in her: vulnerability. Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. "I never thought I'd hear you admit that." Rebecca's lips twitched in a humorless smile. "I didn't think I would either." She took a deep breath, composing herself. "But that doesn't mean I'm backing down, Daniel. I still have a lot to prove. To myself, if nothing else." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Rebecca, at what point does proving yourself stop being worth it?" She held his gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. "You would never understand, Daniel. You never lost the way I did. You moved on like it was nothing." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't move on, Rebecca. I just made a mistake. And I've been paying for it ever since." She studied him for a long moment, her expression softening for the briefest second before the steely resolve returned. "It's too late for regrets." "Maybe," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's not too late to stop this before we both lose everything." Rebecca considered his words, but there was something stubborn in her silence. Daniel leaned forward, his voice more urgent. "Langston will ruin you, Rebecca. He'll take what he needs, and when you're no longer useful, he'll leave you with nothing. You know this." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I do. That's why I'm ending my deal with him." Daniel blinked, surprised. "You are?" She gave him a tired smile. "I'm not stupid, Daniel. I know when I've been played. But don't think for a second I'm coming back to you." Her voice held an edge of defiance, but Daniel could hear the exhaustion beneath it. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I wouldn't expect you to." Rebecca studied him for a long time, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "Here, this is everything I have on Langston. I figure if I'm cutting ties, I might as well bring him down with me." Daniel stared at the folder for a moment before taking it. "Why are you giving me this?" Rebecca sighed, a trace of something wistful in her expression. "Because no matter how much I want to destroy you, Daniel, part of me still doesn't want to see you lose to him." Daniel smirked. "Sentimental, Rebecca. That's a first." She rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. "Don't get used to it." As they sat in silence for a moment, something shifted between them. An understanding, perhaps. An acknowledgement that no matter how much they had hurt each other, Some bonds couldn't be entirely broken. Finally, Rebecca stood, collecting her bag. "Take care of yourself, Daniel. And don't screw this up." Daniel watched her walk away, the weight in his chest feeling both heavier and lighter at the same time. He looked down at the folder she had left behind. Inside was his chance to turn things around, to regain control, not just over his company, but over himself. Back at Kensington Enterprises, Daniel gathered his team. As they analyzed Rebecca's intel on Langston, his confidence began to return. Rebecca had given him the upper hand, and now it was time to use it. Jonathan Pierce, his CFO, looked up from the files, his expression impressed. "This is enough to bury Langston, Daniel. If we act fast, we can secure our position before he even realizes what's happening." Daniel nodded, a smirk playing on his lips. "Then let's make it happen." For the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again. Rebecca had dealt him a blow, but in the end, she had also handed him the tools to rebuild, and he wasn't going to waste them. Late that night, as Daniel sat in his penthouse, Sophia curled up beside him. He felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. Sophia traced patterns on his chest, her voice soft. "So, does this mean it's over?" Daniel exhaled, staring out at the skyline. "With Langston? Almost. And with Rebecca?" she asked hesitantly. Daniel remained silent for a moment, then finally said, "That's a different story." Sophia didn't push, but he could feel the question lingering between them. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he had an answer. Rebecca was gone, for now, but something told him their story wasn't quite finished yet. The next morning, Daniel Kensington stood in his penthouse, staring out at the rising sun casting an orange glow over the city. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The files Rebecca had given him were more than just leverage against Victor Langston. They were his way out. A way to regain control, to rebuild his empire without looking over his shoulder. But beneath the satisfaction, a nagging feeling gnawed at him. Rebecca's departure from Langston's side wasn't just about business. It was personal. She had given him a lifeline, but at what cost to herself? And why did it still matter to him? His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. Jonathan Pierce's name flashed on the screen. "Daniel," his CFO's voice came through, urgent but hopeful. "We've filed the injunction against Langston's holdings based on the information Rebecca provided. The board is breathing easier. Investors are stabilizing." Daniel smirked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Good. Keep the pressure on him. I want his lawyers drowning in paperwork by the end of the week." Jonathan chuckled. "You got it. And Daniel, I don't know how you pulled it off, but I have to say, it's good to have you back." Daniel hung up, feeling the weight on his chest lighten just a little. The damage Rebecca had done could finally be contained. But as he sat down at his desk, flipping through the remaining documents she had handed over, something caught his eye. Something small but significant. A note, scrawled in Rebecca's handwriting on the back of a financial report. It was never about the money. It was about us. Daniel stared at the words, his grip tightening on the paper. He had spent so much time trying to win, trying to stay ahead, but had he ever truly understood what he had lost? Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived at Kensington Enterprises with renewed focus. The office buzzed with a sense of cautious optimism. Employees moved with purpose, and his top executives greeted him with relieved nods. He held a brief meeting, outlining the next steps to ensure Langston's retreat was thorough and absolute. But his mind kept drifting elsewhere. Rebecca. He found himself dialing her number before he even realized what he was doing. The line rang several times before her voice filled his ear. "Daniel," she said, sounding unsurprised. "We need to talk," he said, his tone softer than he intended. Rebecca sighed. "I figured you'd say that." "Where?" "Somewhere without lawyers," he said. "Just us." After a pause, she agreed. "I'll send you the location." Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't sure what he expected from the meeting, but deep down, he knew it wasn't about business anymore. They met at an intimate rooftop bar overlooking Central Park. The setting sun painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, and for a moment, it reminded Daniel of simpler times. times when he and Rebecca had stolen moments like this between board meetings and late-night strategy sessions. Rebecca was already seated when he arrived, a glass of wine in front of her. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time in a long while, there was no hostility in her gaze, just quiet exhaustion. Daniel sat down, studying her carefully. "I read your note," he said finally. She took a slow sip of her wine, then set the glass down delicately. And I think you're right," he admitted. "This was never just about the company. It was about us. About what we had. What we lost." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. "You replaced me, Daniel," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of pain. "Like I was just another business asset to be written off." "I know," he said, leaning in, his voice sincere. "And I regret it more than you know." She met his gaze, searching for something. Maybe honesty, maybe redemption. "Why now, Daniel? Why do you care now?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because losing you cost me more than I realized. And it took this whole mess with Langston to finally see it." Rebecca was silent for a long moment before she shook her head with a soft laugh. "You always were a little slow on the personal side of things." Daniel smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Yeah, I guess I was." She looked down at her glass, swirling the wine slowly. "I don't know if we can go back, Daniel." "I'm not asking to go back," he said gently. "I'm asking if we can move forward, whatever that looks like." Rebecca glanced up, and for the first time in weeks, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Moving forward, huh?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah. No business, no boardroom wars. Just us." She considered it for a moment before offering a small shrug. "One drink at a time, then." Daniel chuckled, raising his glass. "I can live with that." Back at the penthouse later that night, Sophia's absence was painfully noticeable. She had left a short note on the kitchen counter. "You needed closure. I needed more than a ghost in our relationship. Take care, Daniel." He stood there, reading the words over and over, a pang of guilt settling in his chest. Sophia had been right. He had never fully let go of Rebecca. And now, standing in an empty apartment, he wondered if he ever truly could. As he looked out at the city skyline, he realized that moving forward didn't always mean running towards something new. Sometimes, it meant facing what you left behind. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt ready to do just that. Daniel Kensington stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, the cold morning air biting against his skin. The city stretched before him, alive and relentless, a constant reminder of the empire he had built and nearly lost. The remnants of his conversation with Rebecca echoed in his mind, intertwining with the painful realization of Sophia's departure. For years, he had convinced himself that moving forward meant leaving the past behind, replacing it with something newer, younger, more exciting. But now, standing alone with nothing but the distant hum of traffic below, he finally understood. Moving forward sometimes meant confronting what had always been there. The soft chime of his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Jonathan Pierce. "We've secured a settlement," Jonathan said without preamble, his voice tight with relief. "Langston's pulling back. Seems like Rebecca's information did the trick." Daniel exhaled slowly, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. "Good," he said, but there was no triumph in his tone, just quiet acceptance. "We'll draft the final terms," Jonathan continued. "But Daniel." This win came at a cost. Daniel knew exactly what he meant. His company had survived, but his personal life was in shambles. He had alienated the woman who had stood by him, and the one he had chased after was still an enigma, an unresolved thread that he wasn't sure he could ever truly tie off. "I know," Daniel muttered. "Thanks, Jonathan." As he hung up, his eyes drifted toward the coffee table where Rebecca's note still lay. It was never about the money. It was about us. The words felt heavier now, more real. For so long, he had ignored what she meant to him, what they had meant to each other. But where did that leave them now? Later that day, Daniel found himself walking the familiar halls of Rebecca's office. The receptionist gave him a wary glance, but didn't stop him. When he reached her door, he hesitated for just a moment before knocking. Rebecca looked up from a stack of paperwork, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Daniel," she said, setting down her pen, "I didn't expect to see you here." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I wasn't sure I'd come," he admitted, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. "So, what do you want?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling. "Closure," he said, then shook his head. "No, that's not right. I just wanted to see you. Without the lawsuits, without Langston. Just us." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I'm not sure just us exists anymore, Daniel." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I'd like to try." Rebecca sighed, standing and walking toward the window, gazing out at the skyline. "You hurt me," she said finally, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "And for a long time, I thought destroying you would fix that." Daniel swallowed hard. "Did it?" She turned to face him, and for the first time in years, there was no animosity in her eyes, just exhaustion and a lingering sadness. "No," she said softly, "it didn't." A long silence stretched between them before Daniel finally spoke. "So where does that leave us?" Rebecca smiled faintly, a touch of something almost nostalgic flickering across her face. "Maybe it leaves us in a better place than before. Not as enemies, not as business partners, just two people who once meant everything to each other." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling something inside him ease. "I'd like that." Rebecca glanced at her watch, smirking. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Daniel smirked back. "Still keeping busy, huh?" "You wouldn't expect anything less." They exchanged one last look, one that spoke of years of history, of battles fought and lost, of something that once was and perhaps, in some way, always would be. Back at his office, Daniel stared at the framed photo that still sat on his desk. Him and Rebecca, taken years ago at one of their first major deals. They looked younger, happier, and he wondered if, back then, he ever truly appreciated what they had. Sophia had left without looking back, and while part of him regretted it, he knew deep down that she had been right. She had been a distraction from the one thing he could never quite let go of. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair and picked up his phone. After a moment's hesitation, he sent a text to Rebecca. "Lunch next week?" "No business. Just old friends." Seconds later, a reply came through. "We'll see." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe they couldn't rewrite the past, but they could at least try to learn from it. That night, Daniel stood on his balcony again, a drink in hand, staring out at the city that had both given him everything and taken it all away. But tonight, he didn't feel the weight of regret. Instead, he felt something new, something that felt a lot like hope. Maybe redemption wasn't about fixing everything. Maybe it was about accepting the past and moving forward, one step at a time.